If you like the video, subscribe the channel to get new videos like this. The sun began to crest over the distant horizon, casting a pale and watery light across the vast expanse of the prairie, where the tall grass swayed gently in the morning breeze, which carried the scent of damp earth and sagebrush. The canvas cover of the wagon was cool to the touch and damp with the heavy dew that had settled during the quiet hours of the night, making the fabric feel stiff and heavy against the wooden hoops that supported it. Inside the wagon, the air was still and smelled faintly of cured bacon and dried beans and the lingering smoke from the fire of the previous evening, which had burned low and turned to white ash long before the stars had faded from the sky. It was time to rise and begin the slow and methodical process of preparing for another day of travel, a day that would be much like the day before, and the day that would follow, filled with the rhythmic creaking of the wheels and the slow plodding steps of the oxen. The blankets were folded with care one by one and placed in their designated spot in the corner of the wagon bed, where they would remain until the sun set again and the weary travelers sought rest once more. The wooden floorboards of the wagon creaked softly under the weight of movement, a familiar sound that had become the soundtrack of the journey, a constant reminder of the miles that lay behind and the miles that still lay ahead. Outside, the air was crisp and cool, and the ground was hard beneath the boots that were laced up tight to protect against the dust and the rocks and the brambles that lined the trail. The oxen stood in the makeshift corral, their breath visible in the morning air, as they chewed their cud with a slow and rhythmic motion, their large dark eyes watching the activity of the camp with a calm indifference. The process of yoking the oxen was a routine that had been practiced hundreds of times, a dance of leather and wood and iron that required patience and precision as the heavy wooden yokes were lifted and placed across the broad shoulders of the beasts. The pins were inserted, and the straps were tightened, and the chains were linked together with a metallic clink that echoed softly in the morning stillness. The fire was rekindled with a handful of dry grass and a few sticks of sagebrush, the flames licking at the bottom of the blackened coffee pot, which was filled with water from the nearby barrel water that had been carried for miles and tasted faintly of the wood of the barrel. The coffee beans were ground in a small hand mill, the handle turning round and round with a grating sound that seemed loud in the quiet of the morning, and the aroma of the fresh coffee soon filled the air, mingling with the smell of the wood smoke. Breakfast was a simple affair of hardtack softened in the coffee and perhaps a strip of bacon fried in the skillet, the grease sizzling and popping as it cooked over the open flame. There was little conversation as the meal was eaten, the focus being on the task at hand and the long day of walking that awaited. The dishes were wiped clean and packed away in the wooden crate, the utensils wrapped in a cloth to keep them from rattling too much as the wagon bumped along the rutted trail. The oxen were hitched to the wagon, the chains pulled taut as the beasts took the strain of the load, and the heavy wheels began to turn with a groan of protest that slowly settled into a rhythmic creak. The whip was cracked not to strike the animals but to signal the start of the day, and the line of wagons began to move forward slowly, snake-like across the undulating landscape. The dust rose in small clouds around the hooves of the oxen, and the wheels of the wagons coating everything in a fine layer of grit that settled in the creases of clothing and the lines of faces. The walking began a steady pace that matched the slow gait of the oxen, one foot placed in front of the other, over and over again, as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the cool of the morning gave way to the warmth of the day. The landscape changed slowly, imperceptibly, the rolling hills giving way to flat plains and then back to hills again, the grass varying in shades of green and brown depending on the availability of water. Occasionally a bird would fly overhead, a hawk circling in the thermal currents, or a meadowlark singing from a fence post, but mostly there was only the sound of the wind in the grass and the creak of the wagons and the plodding of the hooves. The hours stretched out long and unmarked by anything other than the position of the sun and the changing shadows that it cast across the ground. The mind would wander to thoughts of home, of the life that was left behind, and the life that was hoped for in the West. But often the thoughts would just drift away, leaving only the sensation of walking and the rhythmic swaying of the wagon. Lunch was a brief pause in the middle of the day, a time to rest the oxen and to eat shade could be found. The water in the barrel was warm now, and did little to quench the thirst that came from the dust and the dry air, but it was wet, and it was swallowed gratefully. The afternoon was a continuation of the morning, the sun beating down with a relentless intensity, the heat shimmering off the ground in waves that distorted the distance and made the horizon seem to dance. The oxen moved slower now, their heads low, as they pulled against the weight of the wagon, their sides heaving with the effort, and the foam gathering at the corners of their mouths. The drivers walked beside them, their hats pulled low over their eyes to shield them from the glare, their voices low, as they urged the animals forward with clicks and whistles and gentle prods. The trail was deeply rutted in places, the wheels sinking into the soft earth, or bouncing over hidden rocks, jarring the bones and rattling the teeth. Sometimes a wheel would need to be greased, the wagon jacked up and the heavy hub nut removed so that the thick black grease could be smeared onto the axle, a messy and time-consuming task that was necessary to keep the wheels turning. Other times, a strap would break, or a chain would snap, requiring a halt to make repairs with leather awls and waxed thread or spare links of iron. The sun began its slow descent towards the west, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and the shadows lengthened once more, stretching out across the grass like long fingers. The camp was made near a stream if one could be found, or simply in a flat spot, where the wagons could be circled to form a corral for the livestock. The oxen were unhitched and led to water, and then turned out to graze on the grass, their bells tinkling softly as they moved. The fires were lit again, the wood gathered from the surrounding area or from the supply carried in the sling beneath the wagon. Dinner was cooked as the stars began to appear one by one in the deepening blue of the sky, a meal of beans and salt pork, or perhaps a stew made from a rabbit or a prairie chicken, if luck had been good that day. The conversation around the fire was subdued voices low and murmuring, discussing the miles covered, and the condition of the stock, and the weather, and the trail ahead. The dishes were washed and put away, the fire allowed to die down to coals, and the bedding was laid out once more. The night air was cool and filled with the sounds of the prairie, the chirping of crickets, and the howl of a distant coyote, and the soft lowing of the cattle. Sleep came quickly, born of exhaustion and the rhythmic motion of the day, a deep and dreamless sleep that lasted until the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, and the cycle began all over again. The days blended into weeks, and the weeks into months, the landscape changing slowly from the tall grass of the prairies to the sagebrush of the high desert to the pine forests of the mountains. The routine remained the same. The waking and the packing and the yoking and the walking and the unyoking and the sleeping, a constant cycle that was as predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. The dust was a constant companion, finding its way into every seam and pore, gritting between the teeth and clouding the eyes. The water was sometimes sweet and clear, and sometimes brackish and alkaline, requiring it to be boiled or mixed with vinegar to make it palatable. The food was monotonous and bland, sustaining the body but offering little pleasure to the palate. The clothing was worn and patched and stained with sweat and grease and dirt. Yet there was a rhythm to it, a comfort in the repetition, a sense of purpose in the slow but steady progress towards the setting sun. The wheels turned and the oxen plodded, and the feet walked and the miles fell away one by one, leaving a trail of memories and a hope for the future in the dust of the Oregon Trail. The river crossings were slow and tedious affairs, often requiring the wagons to be caulked and floated across like barges, or the goods to be unloaded and ferried across in smaller boats, while the empty wagons were pulled through the water by swimming oxen. The mud on the riverbanks was thick and cloying, sucking at the boots and the hooves and the wheels, making every step a struggle. The mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, their high-pitched whine a constant irritation as they sought any patch of exposed skin. The sun beat down on the water, reflecting the glare into the eyes and burning the skin. Once across the river, the process of reloading the wagons and reorganizing the goods would take hours. The items checked off lists and packed tight to prevent shifting. The climb into the mountains was a different kind of struggle, the air growing thinner and the slopes steeper, the oxen straining against the pull of gravity, their hooves slipping on the loose rock. The wagons had to be lightened, the precious heirlooms and heavy furniture often discarded by the side of the trail to save the animals and ensure the survival of the party. The nights in the mountains were cold, the frost settling on the blankets and the water freezing in the buckets. The wind howled through the passes, shaking the canvas of the wagons and making the fires dance and sputter. The descent was often more dangerous than the climb, the wagons skidding on the steep grades, the wheels locked with chains, or rough logs tied behind as drags to slow the momentum. The valleys were welcome reliefs with green grass and clear streams and shelter from the wind. The arrival at a landmark like Chimney Rock or Independence Rock was a cause for quiet celebration, a milestone marking the progress, and a chance to carve a name into the stone, leaving a mark for those who would follow. The letters from home picked up at the rare forts or trading posts were read and reread until the paper was worn thin and the ink faded, the news from the east seeming distant and almost unreal in the isolation of the wilderness. The encounters with other travelers were brief exchanges of information about the trail ahead, about water and grass, and the condition of the passes. The encounters with the native peoples were mostly peaceful trading opportunities for fresh horses or moccasins or buffalo robes, though caution was always maintained. The sickness that sometimes swept through the wagon trains was a constant fear, the cholera and the dysentery, and the mountain fever taking a toll on the young and the old and the weak. The graves by the side of the trail were marked with simple wooden crosses or piles of stones, silent testaments to the cost of the journey. But the wagons moved on, leaving the sorrow behind, focused on the survival of the living. The leather of the harnesses creaked, the wood of the yokes groaned, the iron of the tires crunched on the gravel. The smell of the sagebrush after a rain was sharp and pungent, clearing the sinuses and refreshing the spirit. The sight of a herd of buffalo darkening the plain was a reminder of the wildness of the land, a vast living sea of brown fur and horns. The thunderstorms that rolled across the plains were terrifying in their intensity, the lightning flashing from horizon to horizon, the thunder shaking the ground, the rain falling in sheets that turned the trail into a quagmire. The sun always returned, drying the mud and warming the earth. The seasons turned the spring green, fading to the summer brown, and then to the gold of autumn as the destination drew nearer. The anticipation grew, the talk turning more and more to the land that awaited the fertile valleys and the mild climate and the new start. The weariness was bone deep, a physical weight that was carried every step of the way, but the spirit remained unbroken, tempered by the trials of the trail. The final push through the Cascades or the Blue Mountains was the hardest, the weather turning unpredictable, the snow threatening to close the passes. But then the valley would open up below the green fields, and the flowing rivers, and the smoke rising from the chimneys of the settlers who had arrived before. The journey was over. The walking was done, the wheels stopped turning. The silence that followed was strange and heavy after months of constant motion and noise. The body still felt the sway of the wagon, the legs still wanted to walk. But the mind began to settle, to accept the stillness, to look forward to the permanence of a home. The Oregon Trail was a ribbon of dust and dreams stretching across a continent, a test of endurance and a testament to the human spirit. It was boring, and it was hard, and it was repetitive, and it was real. The sun set on the final day, casting long shadows across the valley, the light golden and warm. The oxen chewed their cud in the pasture, the wagon stood silent and empty. The journey was a memory, a story to be told in the quiet hours of the night. A boring sleep story of wheels and hooves and dust and the endless horizon. The moon moved slowly across the ink-black sky, marking the passage of time in a silent arc, while the embers of the fire glowed with a faint and dying red light pulsing gently with the wind that whispered through the spokes of the wagon wheels. The silence was not truly silent, but a tapestry of small sounds, the rustle of a mouse in the dry grass, the shifting weight of a sleeping ox, the creak of a cooling timber. Morning came, not with a burst of glory, but with a gradual graying of the east, a slow leaching of color into the world that revealed the silhouette of the distant hills and the scrubby brush that covered the plains. The air was cold enough to show the breath in white puffs that vanished instantly into the dry atmosphere. and the metal of the wagon fittings was rimed with a delicate layer of frost that numbed the fingers when touched. The daily chores began again, a ritual as old as the trail itself, the gathering of fuel, which on the high plains meant the search for dried buffalo chips that burned with a hot and smokeless flame, a task that required walking in widening circles with a sack or an apron held ready. The chips were dry and fibrous, lighter than they looked, and they were stacked carefully near the fire pit to ensure a steady heat for the boiling of the coffee water. The water barrel was checked, its level noted with a critical eye, for water was life, and the distance to the next creek or spring was never certain. The harness was inspected for wear, the leather straps checked for cracks or weak spots that could fail under the strain of the pull, and the buckles were tested for tightness. A loose strap could mean a sore on the shoulder of an ox, which could mean a lame animal, which could mean the difference between keeping pace or falling behind. The grease bucket swung from the rear axle, its contents a thick black mixture of animal fat and tar, a precious substance that kept the wheels turning and prevented the friction that could set a hub on fire. The application of the grease was a messy job. The paddle dipped into the bucket and smeared onto the spindle, the excess wiped away with a rag that was black and stiff with old grease and dirt. The smell of the tar was sharp and acrid, cutting through the morning air and lingering on the hands long after the job was done. The sun cleared the horizon, a blinding disk of white gold that promised heat and light, and the long shadows of the morning began to shrink back towards the objects that cast them. The order to move out was given a shout that traveled down the line of wagons, and the whips cracked in the air like pistol shots, the sound crisp and sharp. The oxen leaned into the yokes, their muscles bunching under the loose skin, and the wagons lurched forward with a groan of wood and iron that settled into the familiar rhythmic creak. The walking resumed, the steady plodding of boots on the hard-packed earth, the dust rising in little puffs with every step. The landscape was vast and empty, a sea of sagebrush that stretched to the horizon in every direction, its gray-green leaves shimmering in the heat. The smell of the sage was everywhere, a pungent and spicy scent that clung to the clothes and the hair and the skin, a scent that would forever be associated with the long days of travel. The boredom was a physical presence, a heavy weight that pressed down on the mind, the hours stretching out interminably with nothing to look at but the rear of the wagon ahead or the unending expanse of the plains. To pass the time, one might count the spokes of the wheel as they turned round and round, or watch the hawk circling high above in the blue vault of the sky, or simply let the mind go blank and walk in a trance-like state. The midday halt was a brief respite. The sun, high and hot directly overhead, casting almost no shadow, the glare intense and blinding. The oxen stood with their heads down, panting in the heat, their sides heaving, the flies buzzing around their eyes and ears, a constant torment. The bread was dry and hard, requiring it to be soaked in water or coffee to be edible, the flavor bland and uninspiring. The afternoon dragged on, the sun moving slowly down the western sky, the heat unabated until the late afternoon breeze sprang up, cooling the sweat on the brow. The river crossing was a break in the monotony, a challenge that required focus and effort, the water swirling muddy and brown around the legs of the animals and the wheels of the wagons. The bottom was often treacherous, shifting sand or hidden rocks that could cause a wagon to tip or an ox to stumble. The drivers shouted and cracked their whips, urging the teams forward, the water splashing up onto the sides of the wagon, the current pulling at the heavy load. Once across, the dripping wagons were hauled up the bank, the water draining from the beds, the oxen shaking themselves like dogs, the spray flying in all directions. The camp was made on the far side, the routine of unyoking and gathering and cooking, beginning again as the sun finally touched the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of crimson and gold. The night settled in, the stars emerging one by one, the constellations familiar friends in the vast darkness. The Milky Way, a bright band of light stretching across the heavens. The sounds of the camp died down, the conversations ending, the fires banking, the sleep coming quickly and deeply. And so it went, day after day, the miles accumulating slowly, the landscape changing by degrees, the mountains growing closer on the horizon, their peaks white with snow even in the height of summer. The clothes wore thin, the boots cracked, the skin browned and toughened by the sun and the wind. The food supplies dwindled, the flour getting musty, the bacon turning rancid, the coffee running low. Yet the wagons rolled on the wheels, turning the oxen, pulling the people, walking, a relentless tide moving west. The storms were violent and sudden, the clouds building into towering thunderheads that blocked out the sun and turned the day into twilight. The lightning forking across the sky, the thunder shaking the earth, the rain falling in torrents that turned the trail into a river of mud. The hail could strip the canvas from the wagons and bruise the animals and the people, the stones as big as eggs bouncing on the hard ground. Then the sun would return, the steam rising from the wet earth, the air fresh and clean, the rainbow arching across the sky, a promise of better weather. The river valleys provided a change of scenery, the cottonwood trees offering shade and firewood, the grass lush and green, the water clear and cool. The fishing was good, providing a welcome change from the diet of salt pork and beans, the trout fried in the pan over the fire, the flesh flaky and sweet. The berries were ripe in the thickets along the streams, the currants and the choke cherries gathered in buckets and eaten fresh or cooked into a tart sauce. The mountains were a barrier, a wall of rock and ice that had to be crossed, the passes narrow and steep, the air thin and cold. The wagons were hauled up over rocks and ledges, the oxen straining and slipping, the men pushing and pulling, the women and children walking behind, carrying what they could to lighten the load. The descent was terrifying, the wagons skidding and sliding, the brakes screaming, the dust choking. But the valleys on the other side were worth the struggle. The air warmer, the grass greener, the promise of the end of the journey palpable. The arrival in the Willamette Valley was a moment of profound relief, the rain falling softly on the green fields, the mist hanging in the trees, the smell of wet earth and pine filling the air. The land was claimed, the cabins built, the fields plowed, the crops planted. The life on the trail was over, but the memory of it remained, the rhythm of the wheels, the creak of the leather, the smell of the sage, the vastness of the sky. It was a life of hardship and boredom, of routine and repetition, of dust and mud and sweat. It was a life lived at the pace of an ox, a slow and steady walk across a continent, a journey that changed those who made it, leaving them with a strength and a resilience that would serve them well in their new home. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the light dancing on the walls of the cabin, the rain drumming on the roof, a comforting sound after the exposure of the trail. The bed was soft and warm, the blankets thick and clean, the sleep deep and restful. The dreams were no longer of the trail, of the endless walking and the burning sun, but of the future of the crops growing in the fields, of the children playing in the yard, of the life that was being built. The Oregon Trail was a memory, a story to be told to the grandchildren. A long and boring story of a time when the world was wide and the journey was long, and the only way to get there was one step at a time. The axe rose and fell in a steady rhythm, the metal head biting into the wood with a dull thud that echoed through the damp forest, a sound that marked the beginning of a new day and the continuation of the labor that was necessary for survival. The handle of the axe was smooth and polished from hours of use, the grain of the hickory wood visible beneath the darkening caused by the oil from the hands and the dirt from the work. The tree was a towering Douglas fir, its bark thick and deeply furrowed, holding the moisture of the constant rains that fell in this new valley. The chips of wood flew with every strike, landing on the soft carpet of needles and moss that covered the forest floor, their pale yellow color bright against the dark earth. The smell of the fresh sap was sharp and clean, mixing with the scent of the damp soil and the decaying leaves, a perfume of the wilderness that was both invigorating and familiar. When the tree finally groaned and fell, crashing through the branches of its neighbors, to land with a heavy shudder on the ground, the silence that followed was profound and heavy. Then the work of limbing began. The smaller branches lopped off one by one and piled to be used for kindling or for the brush fence that would keep the deer away from the small garden patch. The trunk was measured and marked the lengths determined by the dimensions of the cabin that was rising slowly in the clearing, a shelter against the coming winter. The logs were heavy and unwieldy, requiring the strength of the oxen to drag them into position. The chains pulling tight and the beasts digging their hooves into the mud. The peeling of the bark was a sticky task, the sap coating the hands and the tools, but it was necessary to prevent the rot that would come if the bark was left on. The logs were hewn flat on two sides to make the walls smooth and to ensure a tight fit, the broadaxe swinging in a dangerous arc that required skill and concentration. The corners were notched, the wood chiseled away with care, so that the logs would lock together, forming a structure that was rigid and strong, capable of withstanding the winds that blew down from the mountains. The lifting of the logs grew harder as the walls rose. The heavy timbers rolled up skids made of saplings, the men grunting with the effort, the women watching with anxious eyes. The chinking was the final step in the walls. The spaces between the logs filled with a mixture of mud and clay and moss, packed in tight to keep out the drafts and the driving rain. The roof was made of shakes, split from a cedar log using a froe and a mallet, the wood splitting straight and true along the grain. The shakes were laid overlapping each other like the scales of a fish shedding the water that fell almost daily. The fireplace was built of stones gathered from the creek bed, rounded and smooth cemented together with the same clay mixture used for the chinking. The chimney rose above the roofline, a promise of warmth and cooked food. The floor was dirt, at first packed hard by the passage of feet, but later puncheons made of split logs would be laid, smoothing the surface and lifting the living space above the damp earth. The door was heavy, hung on hinges made of leather or wooden pegs, the latch a simple bar that dropped into a catch. The window was small, often covered with a piece of greased paper or a piece of oilcloth, until glass could be obtained, letting in a dim and translucent light. The interior of the cabin was dark and smelled of wood smoke and drying herbs, and the damp wool of clothing hung near the fire. The furniture was simple and handmade, a table of split planks, a bench of the same, a bedstead laced with rope or rawhide to support the mattress filled with dried grass or corn husks. The days shortened as the winter approached, the sun traversing a lower arc in the southern sky, the light growing weaker and the shadows longer. The rain turned to snow wet and heavy, clinging to the branches of the firs and bending them low under the weight. The world turned white and silent. The sound of the axe muffled the footsteps, soft and crunching. The cabin became the center of the universe, the fire the heart of the home. The routine changed from the frantic activity of building to the slower pace of maintenance and survival. The woodpile had to be replenished daily, the logs dragged in through the snow and cut to length, the sound of the saw rhythmic and soothing. The water had to be carried from the creek, the bucket heavy and cold, the path slippery with ice. The animals had to be fed and watered, the oxen standing in their lean-to, their breath steaming in the cold air, their coats thick and shaggy. The food was simple, the stores brought from the trail supplemented by what could be hunted or gathered. The flour barrel was watched closely, the level dropping slowly but steadily, the biscuits becoming smaller or the dough extended with mashed potatoes or pumpkin. The salt pork was rationed, the brine barrel kept covered. The evenings were long, the light from the fire and a single tallow candle illuminating the small space. The hands were never idle, the women mending clothes that were worn thin, patching the holes with scraps of fabric, or knitting socks from wool that had been carded and spun by the firelight. The men carved tools or fixed harnesses or cleaned their guns, the metal gleaming in the firelight. The stories were told and retold, memories of the home left behind, of the journey across the plains, of the people met and the sight seen. The Bible was read aloud, the words familiar and comforting, the cadence of the language a balm to the soul. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, shaking the door and rattling the shakes on the roof. But inside, it was warm and dry. The snow piled up against the walls, providing insulation against the cold. The isolation was absolute. The nearest neighbor miles away, through the deep snow, the silence of the woods unbroken for days at a time. The mind turned inward, reflecting on the past and planning for the future. The spring seemed distant, a dream of green and warmth that was hard to imagine in the grip of the winter gray. But the signs were there. If one looked closely, the days lengthening by minutes, the sun gaining a little more strength, the buds on the willows swelling slightly. The thaw came slowly, the snow melting into slush during the day and freezing hard at night, the icicles dripping from the eaves. The creek rose rushing and brown with the runoff, the sound of the water loud in the valley. The mud returned thick and clinging, making travel difficult once more. But then the green began to appear, the grass pushing up through the dead leaves, the skunk cabbage unfolding its large leaves in the swampy places, the trilliums blooming white in the shadows of the forest. The birds returned, the robins and the thrushes and the warblers, their songs filling the air with a joyful noise. The planting began, the ground broken by the plow. The rich, dark soil turned over to receive the seeds that had been carried so carefully across the continent. The wheat and the oats and the potatoes were planted with hope and a prayer for a good harvest. The garden was laid out near the cabin, the peas and the beans and the squash planted in rows. The cycle of the year was established, the rhythm of the seasons dictating the work and the rest. The cabin was improved, the gaps filled the furniture, smooth the comforts added one by one. The settlement grew, more wagons arriving, more cabins built, the smoke from the chimneys marking the presence of community. The trail was a memory now, a faded track in the grass, a story in the mind. The reality was the axe and the plow, the rain and the sun, the soil and the seed. The life was hard, but it was good. A life of purpose and accomplishment. The sleep that came at the end of the day was deep and dreamless, earned by honest labor and a peaceful mind. The fire died down to coals. The cabin cooled. The breathing of the sleepers was slow and steady. The moon rose over the valley, casting a silver light on the roof of the cabin and the fields beyond. The Oregon Trail had ended, but the life in the West had just begun, a boring sleep story of survival and persistence and the quiet passage of time in a new land. The summer sun hung heavy and golden over the valley, heating the air until it shimmered above the fields where the wheat stood tall and stiff, waiting for the harvest. The green of the spring had given way to the tawny browns and golds of late summer, a color palette that spoke of dryness and maturity. The hoeing was done, the long hours spent walking the rows, chopping at the persistent weeds that threatened to choke the crop, were a memory in the muscles of the back and shoulders. Now the waiting was over, and the reaping began, a task that required a rhythm as steady as the walking of the oxen on the trail. The scythe was lifted and swung, the blade slicing through the dry stalks with a crisp whispering sound that was repeated over and over again from dawn until dusk. The whetstone was used often, the scraping sound ringing out across the field as the edge was honed to a razor sharpness essential for the clean cutting of the grain. The stalks fell in neat rows, called windrows, lying flat on the stubble to dry in the sun before they could be gathered. The binding came next, the gathering of the cut wheat into bundles tied with a handful of the straw itself, twisted into a knot, a skill that had to be relearned by hands that had grown stiff with other labors. The sheaves were stacked into shock small pyramids of grain that dotted the field like miniature houses standing guard against the weather. The sweat ran down the face and soaked the shirt, stinging the eyes and attracting the small gnats that hovered in the still air. The water jug sat in the shade of the fence wrapped in wet burlap to keep it cool, the water tasting of the earth and the pottery. The threshing floor was prepared a patch of ground beaten hard and swept clean where the grain would be separated from the chaff. The flails rose and fell 2 pieces of wood connected by a leather thong, the heavy end striking the wheat with a dull thud that shook the kernels loose from the heads. It was dusty work, the chaff rising in a cloud that coated the skin and filled the lungs, making the breathing shallow and difficult. The winnowing waited for a breeze. The grain tossed into the air with a wooden shovel, the heavy kernels falling straight back down to the floor, while the lighter chaff was blown away by the wind carrying the dust with it. The golden mound of grain grew slowly, a testament to the months of labor and the promise of bread for the winter to come. The sacks were filled and sewn shut, heavy and solid, lifted onto the wagon and hauled to the cabin, or the newly built granary. The root cellar was opened, the heavy door creaking on its hinges, revealing the cool, dark interior that smelled of damp earth and mold. The potatoes were dug from the garden, the soil brushed gently from their skins, before they were carried down into the dark to be stored in bins. The carrots and the turnips and the beets followed their leafy tops, twisted off their roots, firm and heavy. The cabbages were pulled by the roots and hung upside down from the rafters of the cellar or buried in pits lined with straw to keep them from freezing. The pumpkins and the winter squashes were gathered, their orange and green rinds hard and thick, piled in the corner of the cabin where they would stay dry. The preservation of the food was a race against the rot and the coming cold. The berries gathered from the woods were dried on trays in the sun, or boiled down into thick jams and stored in crocks sealed with wax. The meat was salted and smoked, the smokehouse built of rough logs filled with the smoldering fire of hickory or alder wood, the strips of venison or pork hanging in the dark, absorbing the flavor and the cure. The smell of the smoke clung to everything, to the clothes and the hair and the skin, a scent of safety and provision. The days began to shorten again, the sun setting earlier and rising later, the light taking on the slanted quality of autumn. The leaves on the maples and the oaks along the river turned to flame red and brilliant yellow, a final burst of color before the gray of winter returned. The air grew crisp in the mornings, the frost returning to coat the grass and the roof of the cabin with a white lace that vanished with the touch of the sun. The woodcutting resumed the axe once again, the primary tool, the sound of the chopping echoing through the thinning woods. The pile of firewood grew against the side of the cabin, a wall of fuel that would stand between the family and the freezing temperatures. The chinking between the logs was checked again, any gaps that had opened during the drying of the summer filled with fresh clay. The roof was inspected, the shakes adjusted or replaced to ensure the water would stay out. The oxen were moved to the winter pasture, their coats thickening again for the cold season. The second winter approached not with the fear of the first, but with a quiet confidence born of preparation. The pantry was full. The woodpile was high, the cabin was tight. The rains returned, beginning as a mist that shrouded the hills, and turning into the steady drumbeat that would last for months. The mud returned the paths, turning to mire the boots heavy with the clay. But inside the fire burned bright, the flames dancing in the hearth, the warmth radiating out to fill the room. The evenings were spent in quiet industry, the mending and the carving and the reading continuing as the wind blew outside. The sense of permanence began to settle in a feeling that this was no longer a camp or a temporary shelter, but a home. The roots were going down as deep as the roots of the oak trees in the valley. The memories of the trail began to fade slightly, the edges softening the hardships remembered with a sense of accomplishment rather than pain. The horizon was no longer a distant line to be chased, but the rim of the valley that held the home. The sleep was deep and secure, the sleep of those who have labored and gathered and prepared. The sound of the rain on the roof was a lullaby, a steady rhythmic drumming that washed away the worries of the day. The darkness of the winter night was not a threat, but a blanket, a time for rest and recovery before the cycle began again. The earth slept beneath the frost, the seeds waiting in the dark, the sap still in the trees. The wheel of the year turned slowly, marking the passage of time in the new land. The story continued not with high drama or sudden shifts, but with the slow and steady accumulation of days and seasons, a boring sleep story of life lived close to the earth. The path that led from the cabin to the main road was no longer just a faint depression in the grass, but a defined track worn smooth by the passage of wagon wheels and the hoofbeats of horses, marking the connection between the solitary homestead and the growing community that was slowly taking shape in the valley. The isolation of the first winter had given way to a tentative sociability. As new families arrived, their wagons battered and dust-covered, rolling into the valley with the same look of exhaustion and hope that had marked the arrival of the first settlers. The news traveled by word of mouth, carried by a rider passing through, or a neighbor borrowing a tool. The word spreading, that a barn was needed, or a schoolhouse was to be built. The day of the raising was set, a date chosen when the planting was done, but the harvest had not yet begun. A brief window of time when the demands of the soil were less urgent. The morning of the raising broke clear and bright, the sky a pale blue washed clean by a recent rain, the air smelling of wet grass and wildflowers. The neighbors arrived early, their wagons creaking down the lane filled with tools and food and children, the sound of greetings low and polite, the handshakes firm and calloused. The site for the barn had been prepared, the ground leveled, and the foundation stones set deep into the earth at the corners, square and true. The logs were already there, dragged from the forest and hewn flat on two sides, stacked in long piles that smelled of pine resin and damp wood. The work began without fanfare, a natural division of labor that required few words, the men taking up their positions by the logs, the women gathering near the cooking fires that had been lit a safe distance away. The first logs were laid, the sills heavy and thick, bedded onto the stones and checked with a spirit level to ensure they were flat. The floor joists followed, slotted into notches, cut with a chisel and mallet, the wood fitting together with a satisfying thud. The walls began to rise one round of logs at a time, the corners notched in the dovetail or saddle style that would lock them together against the wind and the weight. The lifting was hard work, the logs growing heavier as the walls grew higher, requiring the use of skid poles and ropes and the combined strength of many men. The shout of heave echoed across the clearing, followed by the grunt of exertion and the creak of the timber as it slid up the ramp and settled into place. The sawdust piled up on the ground, yellow and fragrant, sticking to the boots and the sweaty skin. The sun climbed high overhead, heating the air and baking the backs of the workers, the shirts damp with sweat, the hats pulled low. The water bucket circulated constantly. The ladle passed from hand to hand, the water cool from the spring, but quickly warming in the sun. The sound of the axes and the hammers created a rhythmic percussion, a steady beat of industry that underlined the quiet conversation of the men. They talked of crops and weather, of the price of seed and the health of livestock. the common concerns that bound them together. Near the fires, the women prepared the midday meal, a feast compared to the daily fare of the trail. There were chickens roasting in Dutch ovens, the smell of the browning meat mixing with the wood smoke. There were pies made from dried apples and fresh berries, the crusts flaky and golden. There were biscuits and cornbread and pots of beans seasoned with salt pork and molasses. The tables were makeshift planks laid across trestles covered with checkered cloths that fluttered in the breeze. The meal was eaten in shifts, the men washing the dust from their hands and faces in tin basins, before sitting down to eat with a hunger born of heavy labor. The conversation was livelier now, the food restoring energy and spirits, the laughter quiet but genuine. The children ran in the tall grass, playing tag or hide and seek, their voices bright and clear in the summer air. The afternoon saw the completion of the walls, the plates laid on top to support the rafters. The raising of the roof was the most dangerous part. The heavy timbers lifted high into the air, the men balancing on the narrow walls, the ropes held taut. The ridgepole was set. The rafters spiked into place, forming the skeleton of the roof against the sky. The shingles or shakes were passed up in bundles, nailed down in overlapping rows until the sky was shut out and the interior of the barn was cast in shadow. The doors were hung large and heavy, swinging on iron hinges forged by the blacksmith. The barn stood finished, a monument to cooperation and shared effort, a structure that would shelter the animals and the hay for years to come. The sun began to dip towards the western hills, the light turning golden and soft. The tools were gathered and wiped clean, the wagons loaded up once more. The departures were slow, the farewells lingering, the promise of future help given and received. The silence returned to the homestead, but it was a different silence now, one that held the memory of voices and the physical presence of the new building. The schoolhouse was a smaller affair built a few weeks later in a grove of oak trees near the center of the settlement. It was a simple rectangle of logs with a single door and 2 windows that looked out into the woods. The interior was sparse, a rows of split log benches facing a raised platform for the teacher's desk. The blackboard was a smooth planks painted with a mixture of lamp black and egg white, a dark surface waiting for the chalk. The stove sat in the middle of the room, a cast iron box with a pipe that went up through the roof, the source of heat for the winter mornings. The school opened with no ceremony, just the ringing of a handbell that called the children from the surrounding farms. They walked along the deer trails and the wagon roads, carrying their lunches in tin pails or wrapped in cloth. They brought their slates and their primers, if they had them, precious books that had been carried across the plains. The lessons were simple, reading and writing and arithmetic, the scratching of the slate pencils, the only sound in the quiet room. The teacher was a young woman or an older man, someone with a bit of learning and the patience to share it. The alphabet was recited, the multiplication tables chanted in unison, a drone of voices that drifted out the open windows into the forest. The seasons turned again, the leaves falling from the oaks and covering the roof of the schoolhouse with a brown carpet. The rain returned, drumming on the shakes and turning the road to the school into a muddy track. The stove was lit, the wood crackling and popping, the smell of smoke mixing with the smell of wet wool and chalk dust. The days grew short, the lessons ending before the light failed, so the children could walk home safely. The community grew, the church built next, with a small steeple that pointed to the sky, a place for Sunday gatherings and quiet reflection. The graveyard was fenced off nearby, the first stones appearing white and stark against the green grass, marking the end of the journey for some. The social life of the valley settled into a rhythm of work and rest, of solitary labor and community gathering. The quilting bees brought the women together, the needles flashing in the firelight, the scraps of fabric pieced together into patterns of log cabins and wedding rings. The corn shucking brought the neighbors to the barns. The husks stripped from the ears, the golden kernels revealed the pile of corn growing high. The nights were quiet, the valley sleeping under a blanket of stars or a ceiling of clouds. The homestead was a world unto itself, but it was part of a larger whole, a thread in the fabric of the settlement. The barn stood dark and silent, filled with the smell of hay and the warm bodies of the animals. The cabin was warm and secure, the fire banked for the night. The breathing of the family was steady and slow, a unison of rest. The mind drifted away from the cares of the day, from the crops and the weather and the work. The sleep was a dark ocean calm and deep, rolling over the weary body and the quiet mind. The story of the Oregon Trail had become the story of the valley, the story of the home, the story of the life that was lived one day at a time in the slow and boring rhythm of the earth. The years rolled on like the wheels of the wagon had once done, a continuous and unbroken circle of time that wore deep grooves into the memory and the land. The saplings that had been planted around the cabin to provide a break against the wind were now tall trees, their branches spreading wide and casting deep pools of shade in the summer afternoons. The rough logs of the cabin had weathered to a silver gray, the color of the storm clouds that drifted over the mountains, merging with the landscape until the house seemed as much a part of the earth as the stones in the creek. The face in the mirror had changed too, the skin etched with the lines of laughter and worry and squinting against the sun, the hair turning the color of the dry grass in autumn. The children who had run barefoot through the dust of the trail were now grown, their limbs strong and their hands calloused from the work of the farm. They moved with the confident stride of those who had never known another home, who did not carry the memory of the East, but only the reality of the West. The fences stretched further now, dividing the open range into squares of ownership, the rails split from cedar logs turning gray and covered with lichen. The road was wider and harder. The ruts deepened by the passage of more and more wagons, and now the lighter, faster wheels of buggies and carriages. The rumor of the railroad came first, a whisper carried on the wind of changes coming from the distant world. Then came the surveyor's men with tripods and chains, measuring the land with a cold precision, marking the path for the iron rails. The grading crews followed, an army of men with shovels and picks and mules, cutting a gash through the hills and filling in the hollows, leveling the earth for the track. The sound of their labor was a distant hum, a disruption in the quiet of the valley, but one that stayed on the periphery. Then came the ties' heavy beams of wood soaked in creosote, the smell sharp and chemical drifting on the breeze. The rails were laid strips of cold iron spiked down with heavy hammers, the ringing sound echoing off the hills, a metallic counterpoint to the lowing of the cattle. The first train was a spectacle of smoke and steam and noise, a black monster that huffed and puffed its way across the valley floor. The whistle screamed a lonely and piercing sound that shattered the silence of the night, causing the dogs to bark and the horses to prick their ears. The smoke hung in the air, a long black ribbon that marked the passage of the machine. But soon the train became just another part of the landscape, its schedule as predictable as the rising of the sun. The whistle became a way to tell the time, a marker of the morning and the evening. The train brought goods from the east, things that had once been luxuries or memories. There was cloth that was not homespun fine cottons and silks in bright colors. There were tools made of shining steel, better than the blacksmith could forge. There were oranges in the winter, bright spheres of sunshine that tasted of distant warm lands. There were letters that arrived in days instead of months, connecting the family to the cousins and the friends left behind. Yet on the farm, the rhythm remained largely unchanged. The cows still needed to be milked in the gray light of dawn, the warm milk foaming in the pail, the cat waiting patiently for a saucer. The chickens still scratched in the yard, the eggs gathered warm and brown from the straw nests. The garden still needed to be weeded, the soil turned over with the spade, the smell of the damp earth just as sweet as it had been that first spring. The seasons still dictated the work, the planting and the harvesting and the mending revolving in their eternal cycle. The silence of the woods was still there, just beyond the edge of the fields, a deep and abiding quiet that swallowed the sound of the train and the noise of the settlement. The original settlers sat on the porch in the evenings, their work largely done, their hands resting in their laps. They watched the sun go down over the mountains, the light catching the smoke from the chimney and turning it to gold. They talked of the old days of the crossing of the rivers and the climb over the passes, memories that had been polished smooth by the telling. They remembered the friends who had not made it, the graves left by the side of the trail, the hardships that had seemed insurmountable at the time. But mostly, they sat in silence, content in the knowledge that they had built something that would last. The house was solid, the barn was full, the fields were fertile. The grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter bright and clear, a new generation taking root in the soil. The night air cooled. The crickets began their chirping. The stars came out one by one. The train whistle blew in the distance, a mournful sound that faded into the darkness. The old dog sighed and shifted his weight on the floorboards. The lamp was blown out, the wick smoking for a moment before the room was plunged into darkness. The bed was familiar, the quilt heavy and warm, the pillow soft. The body was tired, but it was a good tired, a tiredness born of a life lived fully. The mind drifted over the years, the images flowing like a river, the dust of the trail, the green of the valley, the snow of the winter, the gold of the harvest. The sounds faded, the creak of the wagon, the ring of the axe, the scream of the whistle, all merging into a gentle hum. The breathing slowed, the heartbeat steady and strong. The sleep came quietly, a deep and dreamless slumber that held the peace of the valley and the stillness of the night. The story of the Oregon Trail was over, but the story of the land continued, a boring sleep story of endurance and change and the endless turning of the earth. The moon rose high above the roof, silvering the shingles and the fields and the iron rails. The world slept, waiting for the sun to rise again and the cycle to begin once more. The end was not an end, but a pause, a quiet moment in the long flow of time. The final breath of the day was exhaled, and the night took over, wrapping the valley in its dark embrace. The wagon wheel now lay half buried in the dirt near the corner of the barn, the iron tire rusting a slow and flaky orange that stained the soil beneath it, while the wood of the spokes had turned gray and brittle, cracking under the heat of the many summers that had passed since it last rolled across the prairie. The grass grew tall around it, hiding the hub where the grease had once been applied, with such care the weeds twining their way through the gaps and the insects making their homes in the rotting wood. It was a silent testament to the journey, a relic that was slowly returning to the earth from which it came. The harness that had pulled the heavy load hung on a peg in the back of the barn, the leather stiff and dry, the oils long since evaporated, leaving it hard as wood. The brass buckles were tarnished to a dull brown, the shine that had once reflected the sun, now gone covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. The mice had chewed on the edges of the straps, leaving ragged marks that told of the quiet winters when the barn was still and cold. The ox yoke sat in the corner, heavy and solid, a piece of history that was too cumbersome to move and too meaningful to burn. The wood was polished smooth, where the necks of the animals had rubbed against it, a ghost of the friction and the sweat of the trail. The iron ring in the center was pitted with age, but still strong enough to hold a chain, though no chain would ever be attached to it again. The trunk that had ridden in the back of the wagon, bouncing over every rut and rock, now sat at the foot of the bed in the farmhouse, covered with a quilt. Inside, the smell was of lavender and old paper, a scent of the past preserved in the darkness. The dress that had been worn on the wedding day was folded there, the fabric yellowed and fragile, the lace brittle to the touch. The Bible with the family names written in the front was there too, the ink fading to a sepia tone, the pages worn soft by the turning of fingers. The letters from back east were tied in a bundle with a faded blue ribbon, the paper thin and crinkling, the handwriting spidery and hard to read. These were the anchors to a life that had disappeared, a life of green hills and crowded cities that seemed like a dream compared to the vast open spaces of the West. The trail itself was disappearing, the ruts that had been cut so deep into the earth slowly filling in with wind-blown dust and water. The sagebrush crept back, reclaiming the path that had been trampled by thousands of hooves and wheels. The wildflowers bloomed in the middle of the track, their roots finding purchase in the packed soil. The wind blew over the plains, erasing the footprints, and the campfire ashes smoothing out the scars of the migration. The silence of the high desert returned a silence that was vast and indifferent to the struggles of the people who had passed through. The coyotes still howled at the moon, their song unchanged by the passage of time. The hawks still circled in the thermals, looking for prey, their keen eyes scanning the ground where the wagons had once rolled. The buffalo were gone, replaced by the cattle that grazed behind the barbed wire fences, but the land itself remained the same, a landscape of distance and light. The river flowed on its water, muddy and cold, carrying the silt of the mountains down to the sea, just as it had done when the wagons were floated across. The cottonwood trees along the banks grew old and died, their limbs falling into the water to become snags that caught the drift and formed new islands. The seasons continued their relentless march, the winter snows covering the mountains in white, the spring rains bringing the green to the valleys, the summer sun baking the earth, the autumn winds stripping the leaves from the trees. The time of the trail was a blink of an eye in the history of the land, a brief moment of noise and motion in the long quiet of the continent. The people who had walked it were returning to the earth one by one, their bodies laid to rest in the small cemeteries that dotted the landscape. The stones were simple, carved with names and dates, and sometimes a verse of scripture. The moss grew on the stone, obscuring the letters, the lichen spreading its slow map of green and gray. The fences around the graves sagged, the wood rotting where it touched the ground, the paint peeling away in white flakes. The memories were fading too, passing from the realm of experience into the realm of story, and then into the realm of legend. The sharpness of the hunger, the bite of the cold, the ache of the muscles were forgotten, leaving only the outline of the journey. The boredom of the daily routine, the endless walking, the repetitive chores, these were the reality of the trail, but they were hard to convey in words. They were feelings that lived in the body and the bones and the blood, a knowledge of endurance that was passed down without speaking. The descendants lived in the houses that had been built. They plowed the fields that had been cleared. They walked the roads that had been paved over the old tracks. They carried the DNA of the pioneers, the resilience and the restlessness. But they did not know the smell of the buffalo chips burning or the taste of the alkali water. They did not know the fear of the storm on the open plain or the joy of the first sight of the valley. They lived in a world of comfort and speed, a world where the horizon was something to be crossed in hours, not months. Yet the land remained a constant presence beneath the pavement and the foundations. The earth was still there, holding the secrets of the past in its dark embrace. The wind still whispered through the grass, telling the old stories to those who would listen. The sun still rose and set, marking the days with the same indifference. The sleep that came to the valley was the same sleep that had come to the wagon train, a closing of the eyes, a slowing of the breath, a surrender to the darkness. It was a sleep that knit up the raveled sleeve of care, a sleep that restored the body and the mind. The story was a circle with no beginning and no end, a continuous loop of life and death and rebirth. The dust of the trail was in the air and the water and the food. It was in the lungs of the people and the fibers of the wood. It was an inescapable part of the existence of the West. The boring sleep story was the story of everything, the story of the atoms and the stars and the slow turning of the galaxy. It was a story that could be told forever without ever saying anything new, because there was nothing new. Only the same old things happening over and over again. The wheel turned, the season changed, the grass grew, and the grass died. The wagon rotted, the iron rusted, the stone crumbled, the silence deepened, the peace expanded, the night went on and on. Through the crack in the barn wall, swirling in a slow and hypnotic ballet that had no beginning and no end, suspended in the air by the slightest currents of warmth, they settled slowly onto the old plow, coating the iron in a fine gray velvet that softened the hard edges and blurred the lines of the metal. The plow sat silent in the corner, its work done, its blade dull and resting on the earthen floor, where the dampness seeped up to meet the rust. The handle was smooth and cracked, the wood dried out by decades of dry air, the grain opening up like the pages of a book that no one read. The silence in the barn was a physical weight, a heavy blanket that muffled the sounds of the outside world, reducing the call of a crow to a distant echo, and the rumble of thunder to a vibration in the ground. The spider webs in the rafters hung thick and heavy, laden with the dust of years, swaying gently in the draft, their intricate patterns broken and retied by generations of arachnids who lived and died in the quiet dark. The smell was of old hay and dry manure and rotting wood, a scent that was ancient and comforting, a smell of the earth returning to itself. The shadows lengthened as the sun moved across the sky, creeping across the floor, like the hands of a clock marking the passage of the afternoon in slow inches. The light turned from white to gold to a deep amber, illuminating the dust motes and the rust in the wood with a final warm glow before fading into the gray of twilight. The night came down soft and silent, wrapping the barn and the house and the fields in a cloak of darkness that erased the boundaries of the world. The stars appeared one by one, pinpricks of light in the vast dome of the sky, cold and distant and unblinking. The moon rose a silver disk that cast long shadows across the grass, turning the world into a landscape of black and silver where nothing moved and nothing changed. The wind whispered through the eaves of the barn, a low sigh that sounded like the breathing of the building itself, a slow inhalation and exhalation that matched the rhythm of the earth. The frost settled on the roof, white and crystalline, growing in the cold hours of the night, forming delicate patterns on the shingles that would vanish with the first touch of the sun. The ground was hard and cold, the frost heaving the soil, slightly lifting the stones, and the roots in a microscopic shifting of the landscape. The roots of the old oak tree slept deep in the earth, anchored in the dark soil, drawing moisture from the hidden veins of water that flowed beneath the surface. The sap was still and thick, waiting for the signal of spring to begin its slow ascent up the trunk. The bark of the tree was rough and deeply furrowed, a map of the years of growth and survival, a shield against the cold and the wind. The owl sat in the branches, its feathers fluffed against the chill, its eyes watching the darkness with a patience that was absolute. The mouse moved in the grass, a rustle so faint it was almost silence. A small life lived in the shadow of the great stillness. The fence posts stood in a row, marching away into the darkness, their wood gray and weathered, leaning slightly with the weight of the wire and the years. The wire itself was rusted and slack, singing a low note in the wind, a vibration that traveled down the line, connecting post to post in a network of metal and wood. The road beyond the fence was empty, a ribbon of gravel and dirt that lay silent under the moon. No wheels turning, no engines humming, just the quiet surface waiting for the day. The hills in the distance were black silhouettes against the starry sky, solid and immovable shapes that had stood since before the wagons came, and would stand long after they were gone. The rock of the hills was granite and basalt, hard and cold, formed in the fires of the earth millions of years ago, and now resting in the cool night air. The erosion was slow, the wind and the rain wearing away the stone grain by grain, a process so gradual that it was invisible to the eye, a clock ticking in geological time. The river in the valley moved black and smooth, reflecting the stars on its surface, a liquid mirror that flowed endlessly towards the sea. The water was cold and heavy, moving over the stones of the riverbed, with a soft gurgling sound that was the voice of the valley. The fish slept in the deep pools, their fins moving slowly to hold them in the current suspended in the dark water. The stones on the bank were round and smooth, polished by the water over centuries, their colors muted in the moonlight. The sand on the bar was cold and damp, marked by the tracks of a raccoon that had come to drink. The willows along the bank hung their branches low, the tips touching the water, a curtain of lace that hid the shore. The mist began to rise from the river, white and ghostly, drifting over the water and spreading into the fields.
Deepened as the night wore on, the small sounds of the evening fading away, leaving only the stillness. The sleep of the world was deep and heavy, a hibernation of the spirit, a rest that went down to the bone. The dreams of the land were slow and long, dreams of seasons changing, of mountains rising and falling, of rivers carving their paths. The consciousness of the observer drifted on this tide of silence, floating on the surface of the sleep, detached and calm. The breath was slow and regular, matching the rhythm of the wind and the water. The heart beat steady and quiet, a drum in the distance. The muscles relaxed, letting go of the tension of the day, sinking into the mattress as if into the earth itself. The mind emptied of thoughts, the worries and the plans dissolving like the mist in the sun, leaving only a blank white space. The darkness behind the eyelids was warm and comforting, a velvet curtain that shut out the world. The story of the trail was a whisper now, a faint vibration in the air, a memory of a memory. The wheels had stopped turning, the dust had settled, the fires had gone out. The destination had been reached, and the journey was over. The boring sleep story had done its work, weaving a net of words to catch the mind and slow it down to the pace of a sleeping ox. The final period was approaching, a small black dot that marked the end of the sentence and the end of the thought and the end of the wakefulness. The silence was complete. The stillness was absolute. The peace was total. The night continued its slow rotation, the stars wheeling overhead, the earth turning on its axis, the universe expanding in the dark. The sleeper slept the deep and dreamless sleep of the just and the weary, and the story ended not with a bang, but with a long and slow fade into the quiet of the night. The embers in the hearth had finally lost their last dull glow, turning from a deep pulsing red to a uniform shade of powdery gray ash that lay in a soft heap at the bottom of the firebox, cold and lifeless. The heat that had once radiated from the stones of the chimney had dissipated hours ago, leaving the air in the room cool and still, with a crispness that spoke of the freezing temperature outside the thick walls. The silence of the house was not empty, but full of the small cephling sounds of old wood and stone adjusting to the cold, the contraction of a floorboard here, the shift of a rafter there, tiny movements that happened on a scale almost too slow to perceive. The darkness was complete, save for the faint luminescence of the snow outside, which reflected the starlight and cast a pale, ghostly glow through the frosted window panes, illuminating the room in shades of charcoal and indigo. The frost on the glass was thick and intricate, a forest of ice ferns and crystal feathers that had grown slowly over the course of the night, molecule by water molecule, freezing in perfect geometric patterns that blocked the view of the yard. The heavy curtains hung motionless on either side of the window, their fabrics stiff with the cold and smelling of dust and old wool, barriers against the draft that sought to enter. The floor was bare wood, polished smooth by generations of feet, but now silent and empty, stretching away into the shadows of the corners where the dust bunnies gathered in soft gray clumps, undisturbed by any broom. The furniture loomed in the darkness, bulky shapes that held their positions with the patience of inanimate objects, the table standing solid on its four legs, the chairs pushed in tight, the cupboard closed and latched. Inside the cupboard, the dishes sat in stacks, the ceramic plates cold to the touch, the glaze smooth and glassy, the cups waiting in rows, handles pointing the same way, a regiment of china sleeping in the dark. The air in the room was dry and thin, lacking the humidity of the day, holding the scent of dried herbs and wood smoke in a suspended state. The ticking of the clock on the mantel was the only rhythmic sound, a slow and deliberate measurement of eternity, the pendulum swinging back and forth with a metallic heartbeat that divided the silence into equal portions of seconds. Each tick was identical to the one before it and the one that would follow, a monotonous and soothing repetition that discouraged thought and invited sleep. The hands of the clock moved imperceptibly, creeping around the dial in a circle that had no end, marking the passage of hours that no one was awake to count. The weights hung low on their chains, heavy brass cylinders that pulled the mechanism forward with the relentless force of gravity. Upstairs, the bedrooms were quiet caves of warmth, buried under layers of quilts and blankets. The feathers in the ticking of the mattresses were still, settled into the shapes of the sleepers, holding the heat of the bodies. The breathing was slow and deep, a collective exhalation that misted slightly in the cool air of the bedrooms before vanishing. The wool of the blankets was rough and comforting, a heavy weight that pressed down on the limbs, keeping them still and secure. The dreams that floated through the minds were slow and disjointed, images of fields and skies, and rivers that flowed without purpose or urgency. Outside, the snow continued to fall, not in a storm, but in a gentle, steady sifting of flakes that drifted straight down through the still air, adding their microscopic weight to the blanket that covered the roof and the ground. Each flake was unique, yet identical in its purpose, to cover, to hide, to silence. The fence posts were capped with white hats of snow. The wires were thick white ropes. The wood pile was a smooth white mound. The path to the barn was gone, erased by the fresh fall, leaving the house isolated in a sea of white. The trees in the orchard stood like black skeletons, their branches traced in white lines, their roots asleep deep under the frozen earth, waiting for a spring that was months away. The sap in the core of the wood was thick and gelid, moving with a glacial slowness, if it moved at all. The seeds in the garden were hard frozen pellets buried in the soil, dormancy their only defense against the winter. The world was paused, held in a state of suspension between the cycles of growth and decay. The geology of the valley lay beneath it all, the layers of rock and soil and gravel resting heavy and immovable. The limestone bedrock was cold and solid, a foundation that had not moved in millennia. The aquifer deep below the rock held its water in darkness, a vast underground lake that felt no wind and saw no light. The patience of the earth was infinite, a waiting that did not expect or hope, but simply existed. The night stretched out towards the dawn, but the dawn was far away, a distant rumor in the east. The turning of the planet was the only real motion, a slow rotation that carried the sleeping valley through the void of space. The stars overhead shifted their positions, slowly, wheeling around the pole star in a grand procession that took all night to complete. The constellations of the winter sky, Orion and the Pleiades and the Great Bear, looked down with cold detachment, their light taking years to reach the snow-covered roof. The distance was incomprehensible, the silence was absolute, the peace was unbroken. The mind of the listener was drawn into this vastness, expanding to fill the quiet, drifting on the surface of the sleep like a leaf on a slow river. The thoughts slowed down, matching the pace of the falling snow, the tick of the clock, the beat of the heart. There was nothing to do, nothing to fix, nothing to worry about, only the long, boring, beautiful night. The sleep deepened, becoming a physical state of heaviness and relaxation, a sinking into the mattress, into the floor, into the earth. The breathing became shallow and rhythmic, a soft sighing that merged with the silence. The consciousness flickered and dimmed, the light of the mind turning down low, like a lamp running out of oil. The darkness was welcome, a soft black velvet that wrapped around the senses and shut out the world. The story had no plot, no characters, no climax, only the endless description of a world at rest. The words were a lullaby, a monotone chant that vibrated in the air and settled in the mind like dust. The stillness was the story, the boredom was the point, the sleep was the goal. And as the snow fell, and the clock ticked, and the earth turned, the sleep came, final and deep and complete, holding the listener in its warm and heavy hand until the morning light returned to wake the world again.